Now, as we've gone through this book, remember some of the things we've covered. We've spent a good while talking about how Jeremiah preached for almost 40 years. And he was called as an older fellow, at least in his late 20s, early 30s. Preached 40 years and received very few converts. Very few people listened and acted, at least long term, on what he did. And in today, modern church terms, I just talked about the numbers we had in church. He would be considered an abject failure. And sometimes we judge as people see rather than as God sees. Remember many years ago when I was in college, we were talking about preaching and such, and a fella asked the teacher, who's the most prominent, preacher in the church? And, we thought of a lot of people in Nashville or Dallas, some of the big cities that were around, guys who preached at really big churches or were on TV all the time. And the teacher talked about how probably the most prominent preacher, the greatest preacher, I guess is how he put it, we wouldn't even know his name. He's somebody who is just with his family in his living room in a very hard situation, maybe on the other side of the world, maybe in the northwest of the U.S., who knows? And while you and I might not expect much from that or be impressed much, God's impressed when we're faithful and we serve him fully. And so when you look at Jeremiah from the outside, he doesn't look all that effective, but God used him and he accomplished a great amount. Remember, we've talked about how this time period that we're looking at, Isaiah has passed away at the beginning of Jeremiah's ministry. Jeremiah is working with two people in Scripture at the same time, or just maybe a little bit after. And that would be Daniel and that would be Ezekiel. Jeremiah is in Jerusalem. He's among the stragglers who are left. Ezekiel is in the river Kibar, or next the refugee camp outside the river Kibar, outside the walls of Babylon. And Daniel would be inside the city of Babylon in the palace. And all three of these men are working in a very similar time period. And it kind of brings the book alive when you start seeing that almost a third, maybe a little bit more than a third of the Old Testament is written right at this time or just immediately afterward. And so as you look here, we see a lot of things going on and a lot of shaping of the world before we get to the New Testament. God is finally doing his final shakeup, if you will, to get us right there where the Son of God will come in the fullness of time, as you read in the book of Galatians. And as you see that, recognize the influence Jeremiah has. Daniel, as he is reading near the end of his book, he runs across a passage. That passage says that there will be an exile 70 years, and he counts up and realizes that time has come, and he prays to God and rejoices. Well, guess whose book he was reading if he found out they were going to be in captivity for 70 years? He's reading Jeremiah. So this book was a book that encouraged the man Daniel. And as you and I read in the book of Ezekiel, we see that he reads a book that says in 70 years there will be a return. So guess who wrote the book that encouraged Ezekiel? It would be Jeremiah. And so it's interesting to see Jeremiah's influence. And it's a book that we don't cover very much, partially because it doesn't translate well in church, because it's kind of negative, and we don't like talking about negative stuff in church. But also because prophecy is a little bit more difficult to us than some of the narrative passages. But we'll hit here from 46 to the end of the book. And as we go through, a little quickly, you're going to see where he closes up by talking about all the nations that are around, Philistia, Moab, and all these people. Finally, he's going to spend some time in Babylon and pronounce that final curse. And then we'll see an addendum at the end of the book, which will cover some of the historical stuff, which has happened earlier, but is put at the end of the book, talking about the very fall of Jerusalem. So that's a little bit of the map of what we're working at as we come through here. So the pronouncements are going to come. Let's see, they're going to come against Egypt, against Philistia, Moab, the Ammonites, Damascus, or we call it Syria, Kedar, Hazor, and Elam, before he goes to Babylon. Now here's the question, why, in so many of the minor prophets and major prophets, does God spend time throwing curses against pagan nations? These people didn't even believe in God necessarily. So why would you spend your time throwing those curses against these pagan nations? What would you think?
It's all about sin.
Okay, it's all about sin. All of sin, falling short of the glory of God. And whether you believe in God or not, you're still under the penalty of sin. Yeah, good point.
And Peter points out that the patience of God has not run out. Is the reason the world now still is.
Okay, yeah, 2 Peter 3.
When he gets totally disgusted with the sin of the nation, he judges it.
Yeah, God would judge a nation when he gets tired of the sins of that nation. We see that in Acts 17, don't we? Where he sets the boundaries of the nations. All right, let me show you what I think, or tell you what I think. Say that you are a Trump supporter, okay? That you like Donald Trump. Your favorite thing is going to be hearing everything that Joe Biden has done wrong. Now, you're not going to enjoy what he's done wrong, but whatever news show you watch or whatever literature that you read, when it starts talking about the things that that political party has done wrong, your ears perk up. And you're like, yes, they are doing that. Now, if you're a Joe Biden supporter, what perks your ears up is hearing everything that Trump has done wrong and going back and forth with that. You know, yes, he did this, and yes, he did that, and did that. And if you're very politically oriented, I'm sorry to bring that up because it might be what you think about the rest of the class period. But when we're against somebody, sometimes we perk up when we hear, you know what? Those Moabites, they did do that. Those Ammonites, they did do that. And the Philistines, yes, they're that way. And then when you come back to you, your ears are perked up and you realize, just as Romans 2 would say, how do you judge those when you've done the very same sins yourself? And it's a lot easier, as Matthew 7 would say, to judge other people than it is to judge yourself, isn't it? And so I think that's one of those things that's going on here. Another thing that's going on here, Jerusalem's destroyed. Judaism, as they've known it, the temple is gone. They're in captivity. The northern kingdom assimilated. They're never coming back. Southern kingdom, a lot of people have questions. If there's no temple, will we ever return home? Is God really in charge? And so when God comes and he's telling them about these people and those people, and they're going to be judged, and especially when he talks about the Chaldeans, or as we know them, it's the Babylonians, and how he is king over the Babylonians, and he's going to destroy them, it reminds them that even in their situation, God is in charge. God is going to rule. God will overcome. And those who are faithful, even to the point of death, are going to receive that crown of life. And so that's a big thing as I want us to notice as we come through and as we see these things. Now, it's very vivid language. Notice, if you will, chapter 48. And we're talking about the Moabites here. 48, 26 through 27. Look how vivid the language is. Make him drunk because he exalted himself against the Lord. Moab shall wallow in his vomit, and he shall also be in derision. For was not Israel a derision to you? Was he not found among the thieves? Whenever you speak of him, you shake your head in scorn. You who dwell in Moab, leave the cities and dwell in the rock, and be like the dove, which makes her nest in the sides of the cave's mouth. You see how just vivid and gross that is? He's saying it's like a man who you want to shame him, so you make him drunk, so he does dumb stuff. And he embarrasses himself completely. And God says their pride is going to shame them, and they're going to be in the very same way. And that very same thing is going to happen to them. So you see that happening with the Moabites, and you see that happening with the Ammonites and the Edomites and all these people as we run through and as we look at these things and notice them. But let's go ahead and skip ahead a little bit to Babylon, because I want us to spend a little bit more time talking about what happened in Babylon and what's going on. And so as we get there, we're going to be in chapter 50. I want us to realize the textual issues that we have here. The theological issues, I guess would be a better way to say that. Skip over with me to the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk, and I'll just tell you what's happening there. You can read it in your own time. Habakkuk chapter 1, the prophet cries out to God, and he says, God, the rich are oppressing the poor. The laws are not being followed in this land. These people are not being righteous at all. So what's he expect? He expects God to come and make everything right. Yeah? Well, God comes back to Habakkuk and he says, Habakkuk, you're right. I'm going to bring the Chaldeans, a terrible, horrible nation, and they're going to come and they're going to slay everybody. They're going to burn down the city and they're going to carry everybody into exile. Well, to you and I, that doesn't sound like a good solution, does it? And Habakkuk says, no, we can't do that. Because how can you use an unrighteous people to judge someone who's more righteous? Yes, Israel's sinning, but you're taking the bottom rung. I'm not hand waving. I'm just making sure it's not a wasp. Okay, it's a housefly. I'm not sure what that means, but it's not a wasp, so that's good. Saw a wasp earlier, and I thought, man, first Sunday we had a bird, now we got a wasp. I guess it's an improvement. Is that an improvement? I don't know. And I'm on video, so sorry, I'm taking these weird journeys. All right. It is a fly. Righteous people, unrighteous people. That's where I'm at. All right, so you had the Babylonians. How can you use evil people to judge unfaithful people? Tempted to try, we're often made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long when there are others who are around us, never neglected, though in the wrong. Remember that song? We used to sing a long time ago. God responds to him, Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, the just man shall live by his faith. In other words, don't worry, I'm going to take care of it. I'm in charge. But that's what's happening here. Here are these Babylonians who are these evil, evil people, and they come in, they take over Israel, and they begin changing everybody's name, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, into names that worship their gods. They're trying to wipe out any memory of Jehovah. They're trying to wipe out any memory of God that would be there. And so it's a terrible thing. So let's start in chapter 50 and read verses 1 through 5. The word of the Lord spoke against Babylon and against the land of the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet. Declare among the nations, proclaim and set up a standard, proclaim and do not conceal it. Say, Babylon is taken, Bel is shamed, Marduk is broken in pieces, this is her gods. Her idols are humiliated, her images are broken in pieces. For out of the north a nation comes against her, which shall make her land desolate, and there no one shall dwell therein. They shall move, they shall depart, both man and beast. In those days and that time, says the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together, with communal weeping, they shall come, and they shall seek the Lord their God. They shall ask the way to Zion with their faces toward it, saying, come, let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that will not be forgotten. Now that is the book of Ezra right there, isn't it? As you open up in the book of Ezra, that's what you see happening. As Babylon has fallen, they're able to come back home, and they're able to be among those folks and be with him forever. And it's such a wonderful thing that we're going to see as it comes through. But what you see here is how God uses the nations. Maybe you have a workshop, maybe you have a tool drawer, whatever it may be. You need to turn a screw, and you look, and is it a standard blade? Is it a Phillips? Is it whatever it may be? You open that drawer, you pull out that screwdriver, the one that corresponds, hopefully, and you turn your screw. You do the job, and when you're done with it, you put that drawer. Or you put that screwdriver right back in the drawer, right back in the cabinet where it belonged. That's how God uses nations. God is not attached to a nation like he was to Israel in the Old Testament. Now, we're one nation under God, and we're a nation that promotes liberty and promotes religious freedom. And we've done more of that than just any other nation that I'm aware of in the history of mankind. But the United States is a tool for God. God, in his wisdom and in his time, is using the United States for his tool. He's doing the same with Mexico, with Canada, with Ukraine, with Israel, with Gaza. Wherever you go, God is using the nations to accomplish what he wants. And when he's done with them, he'll put them away, and he'll use the next tool that's available or that's needed. So Babylon, at this moment, when Jeremiah is writing these things, they look like they're supreme. They rule the world. There's nobody who can compare against them. They are conquering all the way down to Egypt and destroying Nebo, Pharaoh of Egypt. There is nobody who stands before them, and there is a temptation to think that they're going to be in power forever. They're not. It's a short reign, 70 years. One generation, maybe 2 generations total that they'll reign. And God is letting Jeremiah know that God's in charge and not man. And it is man that will always be able to overcome. It's man who shall always be faithful to God is what we have to do. And so there has to be this time of restoration that will come. Now, as you go back to 46, you'll see that Judah is also a tool in the hand of God. And Judah is being cleansed once again. What happened was there's idolatry all the way from the days of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, all the way even in the days of David, all the way through to the captivity. Usually, sometimes they were faithful to God, but there was always a hint of idolatry somewhere. Guess what disappears in that 70 years of captivity? There's no more idolatry when it's over. God finally completely cleanses his people from idolatry. Now, there's a lot of issues in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. There's a lot of issues even in the days of Jesus. People were filled with pride, and of course, Colossians 3:5 tells us that covetousness is idolatry. There are people who are filled with false doctrines and false ideas. There are people who are filled with putting their trust in the wrong nations, but idolatry is taken out. It's interesting how God sometimes can use difficult times to make us be what he wants us to be. And I don't like hard times, and I bet you don't like hard times, but God uses it in an effective way. James 1, beginning of verse 2, consider it pure joy, my brethren, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you can be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. Parallel passage would be Romans 5, 3 through 5. And so what you see, look here in chapter 50 down to verse 17. Israel has been like a scattered sheep. The lions have driven them away. First the king of Assyria came, and now the king of Babylon has come and broken its bones. But verse 18, now I'm going to punish Babylon. Verse 19, I'm going to bring Israel back to his home, and he shall feed, and his soul shall be satisfied on these mountains. In that day I will make things right, and I will pardon those to whom I shall preserve. And so you see there's the opportunity here for them to have, as chapter 50 and verse 6 would say, the hope of their ancestors, so that they can truly and completely be with God and be with the Lord forever. And so that's an important thing for us to notice and to see. But in the days of Jeremiah, some of these things would seem absolutely impossible. It would seem impossible that this world kingdom could be destroyed because they had taken apart God's people. And today, at times, it looks to us like the Lord's church is just not doing well. We look around and we see congregations that are just struggling. We see congregations that do flourish, sometimes are not teaching the old gospel. They've departed from those normal paths, from those good paths, and they're following after the ways of man. There's a lot of times by our plans and our measures, the world seems to be winning. Spend your time in a factory, spend your time in a workplace, spend your time in the school, and it's amazing, horrifying, might probably be a better word, of how powerful and influential and pervasive the world is. But God will overcome. God is in charge. And even those who are evil are being used by God to accomplish exactly what he wants them to be. And so I think it's important for us to see that and to notice that even today and the importance. All right, now let's go ahead and skip over to chapter 52, if you will. And as we get to the end of the book, and you should be proud we got to the end of the book. What's the longest book in the Old Testament? If you look word for word, it's not Psalms. Psalm has 150 Psalms. Longest book is Jeremiah. And we've reached the end. All right. Jeremiah here ends his book in a historical way. And he goes back and he spends quite a bit of time talking about the destruction that's going to happen to the king. And you remember, this is the king who was so mean to Jeremiah. Zedekiah is 21. He becomes king. He reigns 11 years in Jerusalem. In verse 2, he does evil in the eyes of the Lord, just like Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim, remember, they're cousins. For because he angered the Lord, this happened in Jerusalem and in Judea, till he finally cast him from his presence. Then Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And so with that, verse 4, Nebuchadnezzar comes against it, the city of Jerusalem, and builds that siege wall. And it was under besiegement for a good while, until finally everybody starves in verse 6, and the wall's broken through in verse 7, and everything is destroyed. Now, the king runs away in verse 8, but he's caught. And as they bring him, he pronounces judgment, the king does, and he kills the children of the king before his own eyes and all the princes. And then he puts out the eyes of the king and takes him to Jerusalem or to Babylon to stay in prison until he dies. And so as you and I look at that, we see in verse 12 and 13 the destruction of the temple. And we see where the people are carried away into captivity in verse 15. But we see that some people are left behind, and they will be there in Jerusalem for a while. And then as you continue looking through there, you see the destruction of the temple, and how the temple is taken apart, and the desecrations which are going to go on around there in the temple. You see in verse 25 the people who are carried into captivity. And then you see in 29 and 30 all the terrible things which are happening with the captivity which will occur. And then we see where there are few people who are taken care of. Jehoiakim will be able to be before the king for a few years. And then you see the end as it looks with the king and the royal family. Now that's what Jeremiah saw at the end of his life. Jeremiah was able to speak of the 70 years. But the last that he saw was the death of the king who hated him, but still the death of the king. The last thing he saw was the destruction of the temple. The last thing that he saw was the carrying of all the people whom he loved and who had listened to him away to Babylon. How would you feel if you'd been faithful to God for 40 years, preaching the word of God, warning the people of the destruction that was coming, and you were right? And you were right. The words of Jeremiah came to pass. He was right. But instead of feeling vindication, everything he knew and everything he loved was destroyed. So the last part of Jeremiah is the book of Lamentations. And what the book of Lamentations is an official funeral. And they did funerals, especially songs, differently in those days than we do today. Our songs are in 4-part harmony, and our songs are pretty to listen to, right? In the Old Testament, usually a song was more or less a solo, and it was just a meandering, if you will, person. He's singing, but he's telling a story. The Song of Moses, the Song of Deborah, right? Judges chapter 5. Jeremiah is a funeral dirge. It's a funeral song sung over the city. Jeremiah is in a cave because everybody's getting carried away. He sees the city burning. He sees the temple destroyed. He sees the glimmer of the bronze and the gold being carried off. And maybe the dust in the far off from the feet of the people who are walking into captivity. And in his last act as a prophet, he preaches a sermon, preaches a funeral over the city he loves. And that's what Lamentations is. Now, they didn't rhyme in the Old Testament like we rhyme in our poems and our poetry. They didn't have vowels, so it was really hard to rhyme. And so what they would do is a lot of times they'd use an acrostic. And if you'll notice, chapter 1 of Lamentations has 22 verses. Chapter 2 of Lamentation has 22 verses. Chapter 4, we'll come back to 3. Chapter 4 has 22 verses. And chapter 5 has 22 verses. All right, guess how many letters there are in the Hebrew alphabet? 22. So it's like A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for carrot. That's the sort of thing. Every one of these verses starts with a letter in the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew alphabet. And now chapter 3, it goes, we would say in ours, A, B, 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 C, C, C. And so chapter 3 has 66 verses. But what Lamentations is about, it's a funeral over the city and the destruction which has happened. See there, verse 1, how lonely sits a city. It was full of people. She's a widow who is great among the nations and a princess among the provinces, but she's now a slave. He talks about how in verse 4, the road to Zion mourns. He talks about the uncleanness in her skirts and the way in which she acted in the past. Look at verse 12. Jeremiah says, why isn't everybody weeping? Is it nothing to you to see the destruction of God's people, the things which have happened? As chapter 2 opens, he talks about the Lord and his anger. And he sees that anger which is there. Verse 5, the Lord's an enemy and he swallows the people up. And he sees the absolute destruction of all these things which are happening. The terrible, terrible things which are going on. And 2 verse 11 is maybe his most famous verse. My eyes, they're filled with tears. My heart is troubled. The bile of my body is poured out on the ground because of the people who are dead. And the destruction which has happened, and all these things which are going on. As he goes through, it's just so sad to see the destruction which has happened. But in the midst of that, there's a song that we sing. And the song doesn't quite go with my translation, but you'd recognize it. You recognize it when you look at it. Let me see where we put this on. Chapter 3, verse 22. And I'll tell you the words of the song rather than read you the verse. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. O Lord, great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I shall hope in him. You remember that song? We used to sing that a lot, didn't we? Especially in youth group. That was a youth group song for many, many decades. Sometimes they even sing it today. What makes that song beautiful? It's a jewel, but what makes that jewel beautiful is the background. In the midst of the stink of the flesh of burning bodies, in the midst of all the smoke and all the destruction of the lagging soldiers who are trying to kill whoever's left that they can catch, Jeremiah realizes there's still something beautiful here. God is going to bring his people back. Jeremiah says, I may not be there the day it happens, but it will happen. God is gracious, and he's going to see his people through this difficulty in his hurt. And that verse means a lot to me, and I think it means a lot to you, because a lot of times in life we suffer and we hurt. And that backdrop of our life sometimes just seems so difficult. But there's that jewel of God's faithfulness. And we don't have the time necessarily, but if you roll through the book of Jeremiah, you see these little jewels which are placed here and there, right? Remember chapter 31, which is quoted in Hebrews 8? I'm going to make a new covenant. A covenant not like made in the physical nation of Israel, but a covenant of the heart, where people will love God, where people will be a part of God. And that's a prophecy of the church, right? The jewel of 70 years, and we'll be back home. We'll be cleansed, and the people will then be faithful to God. And so what you see in Jeremiah's life, he's a weeping prophet. But in a sense, there's no prophet more positive than him, because he recognizes the evil, but he shows you God's still here. God is still there. When I went to college, we had a lady who was over our dorm named Opal Wakefield. She was a very, very sweet lady. And I remember one time she was talking to all the guys. We'd just done a devotional of some sort. And she was telling us about how when she was a younger lady, that she was married to a preacher. And her husband, I guess he was a good preacher, but he was located in a lot of different places a lot of times. He's one of those guys that moves every 2 years. And life was stressful, money was short, and one day they'd gone to church on a Wednesday night, and they came home, and their house had completely burned down. And they had lost everything, and they were in trouble. And she told us about how she was walking in the embers, kind of looking to see if there was anything they could save, and really, there wasn't anything to save. And she said at that moment she looked up and she'd never seen the stars look so bright. And she realized she had never really looked at the stars that way before. And she realized, you know what? God is here and God's going to take care of us. Life may seem terrible, but God will take care of us. Now, you don't have to burn down my house. I'll look at the stars. But that's what Jeremiah is telling us, isn't it? Even when life is dark, God's still there. And even when we're so upset because the people that we're preaching to and encouraging will not listen, God is there. And He will take care of us. And He will do well. And that's a very important lesson for us to know and for us to follow. All right. Now we got just a few minutes. Next week, we're going to start a new study. I think we're going to study the book of Daniel. That sound okay to everybody?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Sounds like Dan's going to be teaching it. What you got, Dan? See you guys' hand raised. Yeah.
Chapter 2, verse 11. My heart is troubled, my bile is poured on the ground.
Yes.
When your bile comes up in your stomach, he's on it.
Yes.
And what he's saying, he's very distressed.
Yes, he's distressed. Today we're all about the antacid. His stomach is so twisted from stress that all that acid is coming up, causing him to throw up, causing him just to be miserable.
But also, he is still alive.
Yeah.
We are all still here, so we can rejoice.
Yeah. God will help you through it. God will absolutely help you through it. Yeah, one of the things about Hebrew, and even in the New Testament, they didn't really say emotions. They didn't say, man, I'm happy or I'm sad, right? Well, you do have rejoice. But usually their emotions were spoken of in physical ways, I used to joke when I taught teenage classes about the bowels of mercy, which Paul would talk about. And pretty much it was like, I love you so much, it gives me an upset stomach. Now, in our culture, you don't want to hear that at church, right? But that's how they spoke back then, was they would talk about the physical attributes there.